Good morning, museum dudes! My name is Diana, and welcome to Diana Does Museums. Let's start this thing off by talking about what exactly a museum is. Now, it might sound easy to define a museum. I mean, you can look up the definition in any dictionary, so someone must have done it. But there's actually a lot more going into the conversation than you might think. In order to best illustrate my point, let's take a walk to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or the Met, here in New York City. When you type define museum into the Google search bar, this is what comes up. A building in which objects of historical, scientific, artistic, or cultural interest are stored and exhibited. That's bland as shit. I mean, that definition just doesn't at all capture how I think museums exist and function in this day and age. So let's fix it. Oh boy. It's true that most museums do exactly as that definition says. They have objects and they exhibit them. The Met has over 2 million objects in its collection, and it usually only shows about 1% of that at a time. Let me just say that one more time. The Met has over 2 million objects in its collection, and it displays only 1% of that. What is it doing with all of that stuff if it's not on display? What a museum does with its objects besides exhibiting them is part of what makes museums different from universities, libraries, galleries, and other institutions like that. So to me, this definition is missing 3 very important factors in defining museums. 1, its conservation facilities. 2, its educational and research standards. And 3, museums are parts of museums that exist outside of the building. Let's take each one of these one at a time and mold our definition along the way. Sometimes museums acquire objects that are just a mess. This guy's limbs are broken off, this work of art on paper has been left in a sunny room for too long, this painting's got layers of aging scum that need to be wicked off. I mean, look at this guy, he's got no legs. And look at this guy, he's only legs. All these things that conservationists do are reactive. Something's wrong with the artwork to begin with and they need to fix it before things get worse. But if you're the head conservator at a collection with 2 million objects like the Met's, are you going to want to work reactively to every single object in its collection? No, absolutely not. You are only going to live probably like 90 years if you're lucky, so no, you're not going to have the time to do that to begin with. What conservationists do is think proactively about objects. How can they be stored and displayed so that they last for as long as possible? How often and for how long can certain objects be put on display before their physical integrity comes into question? This is an integral part of how museums work and how they make sure objects last for generations to view and study. If every object was mishandled or misstored, they're not going to last very long. So for now, let's change the definition to this. A building in which objects of historical, scientific, artistic, or cultural interest are stored, preserved, and exhibited. Alright, so the second issue I have with this definition is that it makes no mention of something that I hold very dear to my heart when it comes to museums: education. People spend years not only learning about an object or culture, but how to best display that object so that people can learn about it. Labels in museums go through multiple rounds of editing and approving before they're actually put up on the wall. At the Met, there are workshops and lectures spanning different topics, not just about art, including history, creative writing, science. Every museum's public is different, and museum educators spend years trying to figure out not just what a public wants, but what it needs. To me, the core of museums is education, and without it, it's just a completely different place. Alright, let's see what our definition looks like now. A building in which objects of historical, scientific, artistic, or cultural interests are stored, preserved, and exhibited for educational and research purposes. Okay, I know educational and research purposes is probably not the best term, but for today it'll have to do. My third issue with this definition concerns a new development in museums. When museums as we know them today, these public museums, were first developed, they were made to uplift and civilize the public. They were also made to display power, but that's a discussion for a different day. As they evolved though, museums became more about education, presenting accurate information, funding research, and hosting educational programming. But museums are expanding on this idea now. Why should you have to come to a museum to learn from a museum? Museums are stationary, and if you can't take the time or don't have the money to come to New York, you'll never be able to see the Met's collection. Well, that's changing. One of my favorite things on the Met's website is their 82nd and 5th project. For this video project, 100 curators were asked to speak about one of their favorite pieces in the museum and why it moves them. It gives the viewer a look into objects they may never see as they walk through the museum, or gives them new eyes on an object they may have thought was just ordinary. This program gives you a glimpse not only into the actual collection, but into the real people working at the museum. Besides the content, I mean, these things are shot beautifully. You can pick a random episode, search by tags, or browse through photos of curators to choose a work to learn about. You can twirl the object around in a 360 spin like you could never do in a museum. To me, this is where museums need to continue to move, outside of their walls and into the homes and internet cafes and libraries of people who may never be able to visit them. This is the hardest part about changing the definition because it's the newest idea and it's also the least tangible, so I've had to change the format a little bit, but this is what I've come up with. An institution which dedicates itself to the storage, preservation, and exhibition of objects of historical, scientific, artistic, or cultural interest for educational and research purposes, whether in a building, website, or other manner. Alright, so I know institution isn't the best way to put it, and I know the or other manner at the end leaves a lot of holes in the definition, but I also think it leaves a lot of room for growth. I think the most important thing to realize is it's not the definition that really matters. Museums are evolving just like everything else on this planet. Plenty of museums that we're going to visit on this channel are not going to fit into this definition, and that's okay. Museums have changed since their inception, and they'll continue to change for as long as they're around. I'm ready to grow and change with them. Thanks for coming to the Met with me, and I'll see you at the museums.